In two different locations this week, we have seen normal citizens taking to the streets to stand up to long-term corruption. These countries are Belarus and Lebanon. In Belarus, the anger is over the sham election that just occurred in which Aleksandr Lukashenko won his sixth term as president, though it's clear that he has maintained his power through undemocratic means. Across the globe, well, not across the globe, in Lebanon, the explosion last week in Beirut's port left over 200 people dead, 300,000 homeless already. Since the disaster, it has seemed to exasperate the current political and economic turmoil. Since the disaster, Prime Minister Hassan Diab and his government have stepped down. Today, we are going to look into all the problems in both these countries concerning corruption and why there's a trend around the globe of protesting against it. Hey everybody, and welcome back to the Tonic podcast. Alex Kapitko here. I hope your day is going well. And I am joined with Drew Nepley. Drew, how are you, my friend?
I'm doing good, enjoying the stream. Again, for those that don't know, we do live stream on Twitch these episodes, so please, check us out, the underscore tonic underscore record, to catch our live pretty faces. And I'm excited to dive into this.
Cool, man. Yeah, so why don't we just start with Belarus, because that was actually one that I wasn't as aware of. I think everyone's talking about Lebanon right now.
Yeah.
And Belarus is kind of interesting, right? I mean, this is an old Soviet state that, while a lot of other Soviet states have kind of been more accepted into Europe, Belarus definitely seems to still be more closely tied with the East and Putin and Russia. And yeah, President Aleksandr Lukashenko has pretty much been a dictator in Belarus for a long time. And he's actually considered Europe's last dictator. Yeah. And so I guess earlier this week, he claimed a landslide re-election victory, though a lot of people don't buy it. He claimed 80% of the vote. And as you and I talk, in a democracy, it is really hard to get that high of a percentage. And so it does, raise some questions. And now there's protests and there have been deaths. It's turned violent. And I mean, just a little background, right, on Belarus. I mean, this is a country which the Risk and Compliance Portal claims to be completely corrupt. They say, in quotes, corruption is present at all government levels: customs, public procurement, construction. This is just a country where bribes, money laundering, the criminal code is very lopsided. So I'm not too surprised. But since these protests, internet has been limited, public transportation's been limited. So what are your thoughts on this? Do you think this is the beginning of change, or maybe a doubling down on authoritarianism?
It's tough to say. I definitely think that it's one of the more blatant instances of, election fraud and corruption. Again, getting 80% of a vote in any democracy is next to impossible. And especially against, the opposition candidate, whose name is, I'm going to butcher this, but Svetlana Schickonovskaya.
That's pretty good.
She supposedly only got 10% of the vote, and then 10% was someone else. But this was someone who just months ago was having some of the largest rallies in Belarus since the fall of the Soviet Union. She was garnering tens of thousands of people. Her husband was previously a candidate who was jailed. So this is someone who had, she was almost basically the victim of corruption in her family, and became a symbol of this resistance, this counter-party, and almost like a Bernie Sanders, not politically, exactly, but in the sense of that energy and that large rallies and garnering a lot of people of different, backgrounds. She was kind of doing that, and then for her to get 10% of the vote, we don't know exactly how much she got, but I bet you it's a lot more than that. And so I think it's such a, now we're seeing protests. I think it's such an obvious form of election corruption that I don't know if the people will go quietly, right? I mean, we've already seen violence. People have been, a protester was killed not long ago. What's his name? I'm blanking on his name right here. Lukashenko. He's called the protesters gangsters. I don't think this is going to go away quietly anytime soon, and especially in such an open world where, with social media, and I think people are kind of waking up more so in Europe, especially to the kind of corruption. I don't know. I think Lukashenko's in trouble, but we'll see what he does. I mean, he might double down. He's kind of already has doubled down with, his riot police and the violence. And just today, unfortunately, Svetlana had decided to flee for her children's sake to Lithuania. So the head of this opposition movement is gone. It's going to be just kind of up to the people. So it is really tough to say what's going to happen next.
Yeah, like going back to what you said about social media, I just thought of this term right now, but you could almost think that we're kind of seeing a global kind of accountability of the masses or something like that, where there are so many protest movements going on around the world for different reasons, but they're all based somewhat around systematic problems, whether that's racism in the US, corruption in Lebanon and Belarus, or political violence in Russia, right? Or in Venezuela for just how the regime is handling things. Hong Kong, exactly. Like, I would almost argue it almost feels like this is one big protest movement kind of that's just calling out for accountability. And I almost feel like because there's so much footage from so many different countries around the world, it's going to be hard to get rid of that. It's going to be hard to quiet that down. And it's cool for me to see. I mean, especially because this freaking election, I mean, the only countries that endorsed it, I think, were Russia and China. And, there's reports that Russia was definitely involved in this one way or another. And I agree with you that I think this is going to be one that's going to be hard to quell. I'm going to butcher this name as well. But it's Svetlana Aleksandrovna Alexievich, who won the 2015 Nobel Prize in Literature, who is from Belarus. She said that the world needs to be warned of Belarus's soft dictatorship, and it is alarming because this guy has been president since 1994, pretty much as soon as Belarus was out of the Soviet Union. And so it seems to me like Russia has kind of in a lot of ways helped prop this up. So one of my big takeaways from this is that I almost feel like all these like satellite issues to Russia are all almost like a giant rebuttal to what Putin's doing, right? Because I almost feel like this election is just people protesting exactly what Putin's doing, and we're seeing unrest in Russia. And so I wonder if this is almost the beginning of a message to say that either Putin is also going to face issues or he is also going to maybe lead to more oppression.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. Like you said, he's been around since the mid-'90s, right after the Soviet Union fell. Maybe at first people didn't know what to expect, and so he kind of, was able to stay in power. But at this point, again, with social media and the images like people see of functioning democracies, now, I mean, a lot's up in the air currently, but the United States is a functioning democracy that has seen the peaceful transfer of power with limits on, the executive branch and the term limits. People know what that looks like. People are more and more familiar with, hey, why do they have an 8-year limit and we don't? And this guy's been, he just won his 6th term. People are waking up to what a democracy should look like, should be. And they're realizing that Belarus isn't that. And same thing with Russia. A democracy. Putin's elected. I think more and more people are realizing there's no way we live in an actual functioning democracy. Putin's been in power for decades, and he even did a little switcheroo with power that was, it's so obvious. So I think you're right that on the grander, and Hong Kong too, they understand that, like, China's not our friend. We know what democracy looks like, and this is a police state. People are familiar with what things should be now that maybe they weren't at the end of the Soviet Union, right? The Soviet Union fell and they were like, okay, well, we're going to try something new and let's see what happens. Now at this point, especially youth that are connected into the the internet and everything, they know that something is wrong. So yeah, I wonder how long this will last, and I do think you're right that it is tied to Putin in general and that kind of cabal of his his Eastern European power.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, the Hill had a really good piece that kind of looked into that, where they were talking about how public opinion polls and just trends seem to show that whatever has happened in Belarus now, and then back in Ukraine in, I think, 2014, 2015, is almost just a harbinger of what's to come in Russia's future. And but they argue that it would definitely be much more violent. Obviously, Russia's a bigger country, more of an authoritarian apparatus, secret police, Putin still has a very high popularity in certain provinces, and it's kind of worrying to me, you know. And like, I think one side, I like to think that the younger generations and the more access they have to technology, to information, to seeing how a democracy is supposed to work, that they're going to speak out and hopefully bring change. But there's also part of me that worries that in countries like Belarus, Ukraine, Russia, maybe even Hong Kong, which is obviously not a country, but still, I almost worry that because they don't already have existing democratic apparatuses that work, it'd be very easy for the government to just black them out. And I think that's what we saw. I think that's what we saw Lukashenko try to do here. You know, like quelling the internet, limiting public transportation, and so part of me does worry that what if the backlash to all these social media protests and this mass awareness would almost be digital blackouts in these places, and that scares me a little bit, especially in some of these ex-Soviet blocs that still do seem to have a Soviet playbook. I just worry that almost all of a sudden maybe we don't hear from them and they slip closer and closer to a North Korea type of situation.
Do you think then, I have a question for you then. Do you think then that to avoid that, like places like the European Union has a responsibility, because Belarus is not part of the EU, but obviously is in Europe. And do you think that like the EU bloc has a responsibility to do something about this, or to, you know, have some kind of incentive for Belarus to move more westwardly?
I think that's up to the people. I couldn't give you like the specifics to Belarus. I couldn't give you. I think it really depends on culture, and I think culture is something that we always leave out when we talk about this. As far as I know, and I'm obviously no Belarusian expert, but I do get at least from the little knowledge I have, that their culture is more in line with Russian culture, and a lot of Russian culture and a lot of more Eastern cultures do value a stronger central authority. And a lot of countries like that are down to give up specific rights in turn for security. And so, as an outsider, I think it would be almost politically dangerous for the EU specifically to get involved, because they could have differences in opinion and differences of outcome. But at the same time, I do believe there needs to be some international recognition. But that would be if the situation got worse. Because right now these protests will probably lead at least to one of two things: violence or accountability. And I just almost feel like it couldn't just be the EU. It would need to be an international body that consists of many different cultures from around the world, because I think, based on just the history in Europe, I think Russia, Belarus, countries like this would just feel like they're being bullied by a West that is in America's pocket. So I can't give you a good answer there, honestly, because it's tough. But I don't know, honestly, if a Western response would really help. But I also, again, don't know what would. I'm sorry.
I think you made a really interesting point, because that idea of, you know, it has to be from the people, that a Westerly force, you know, could actually be detrimental, because already Lukashenko has said that a lot of his protesters are, you know, funded by the British. He said that they're funded by the British, and, you know, and they're all just, you know, goons. You know, that idea of a foreign entity is the one driving this social change, not the people themselves. So he's already started that narrative. So maybe you're right that maybe something like the EU, obviously not, you know, Britain's not part of it anymore, but the EU, like an outside force having an impact, might just lead to that narrative becoming stronger of, this isn't Belarusians' problem, this is outsiders trying to take me down, which I don't think is the real case. I think you know, the people of Belarus want change, at least those outside protesting. But I think that's a really interesting point, that it really does have to come from some of these like internal corruption, and real lasting social change has to come from the people. Because if it is spearheaded by outsiders, I don't think it lasts. So let's take a look at the next one, the one that I think more people are talking about, which is Lebanon. You know, we all know that the tragedy of the explosion in Beirut was super deadly, and it was a product of negligence and graft, and to do with the ammonium nitrate improperly stored in this port. So obviously, you know, right out the gate, you know, this is a tragedy. It's very sad for these families, but it also has larger implications as far as the corruption in the state. And this is a country that has already been on a serious economic downturn for the last year, has gone through two and now three prime ministers within that time. It was already super shaky and rocky, and then this explosion, I think, is just the straw that really broke the camel's back, almost literally. And now people are in the streets of Lebanon protesting and calling for serious structural change to their government.
Yes, and I think it was back in November or October, maybe, we talked about Chile's protests, and I remember at the same time there were protests happening in Lebanon as well. So, this economic strife is nothing new. These political problems, like you said, are nothing new, and I think that's kind of what this explosion did. It was almost like the textbook example of what happens when you have widespread and rampant corruption over decades, right? Like this ammonium that was stored here. I mean, you could say how forever, whatever reason you want, but there have been warnings for years about it not being able to be kept there for security reasons, public safety reasons, and there was just no attempt to do anything about it. And for me, what it kind of highlights is that, yes, the president stepped down, right? Or sorry, Prime Minister Hassan Diab stepped down, right? And he said, or not just him, right? Him and his party stepped down, saying that they want to put the government back to the people. But that's BS. Like, they're not going to put the government back to the people because, like you said, there's been numerous administrations and nothing's really changed. And so, like, I mean, kind of the example I want to use here is that in 2005, Lebanon had a similar crisis in which a terrorist explosive killed their prime minister, Rafik Hariri. And this led to similar protests and public anger. And what actually led to there being some form of stability and outcome that was good was that the U.S. helped lead a global effort to put money into NGOs, private groups, and international organizations like the Red Cross. And now the problem, obviously, we're facing right now is that the White House is not really willing to help, right? The White House would not want to streamline an expedition to do this. But so right now we're seeing Emmanuel Macron is spearheading a movement basically to get together international funds. And let me see here. Yeah, he wants to get countries to basically put up a joint fund to help the country. And a lot of international scholars say this is the wrong step, because the money's just going to go back to the corrupt organizations that originally were, responsible for this. And I mean, to understand how bad this corruption is, the government started taxing WhatsApp people. So they were taxing your average worker because they were using WhatsApp, because the government was that deep in the hole. And that's a misappropriation of so many funds. And so foreign policy says that in order to do this, basically, we just need to put the money into NGOs and nonprofits like the Red Cross, because the Lebanese people have no trust in their government. So how could putting more money towards these governments help?
I 100% agree with that. I think that if you're going to start giving aid to the government of Lebanon, it's not going to. The whole point is that all these problems are because of these elites in the government that are super corrupt, that are working with banks to basically funnel money out of the Lebanese economy and into their pockets. So much so that there were reports that there was like limits on how much the average person could withdraw from their bank because there just wasn't funds in the bank. The number in your account would be there, but the actual currency was depleted. So it was like, you can only withdraw a certain amount of money at a certain amount of time from your bank, even though you have more. It's like, wait, no, that's my money. That's not yours. This is like Great Depression style stuff where you literally just can't take your money out of the bank because there's just not enough in there. And then on top of that, the IMF last year was trying to work with Lebanon, but what part of the things was limits on the kind of liquidation that these banks could go for. So then the Lebanese government said, no, we don't want your help, IMF. We're not going to take any of your aid because that messes up with our bottom line, our back pocket bank dealings. So so how would any foreign aid from wherever it comes from, the United States, France, how would that help if it's just still in the infrastructure where it's just going to get siphoned off to the elite, to the political class? So yeah, I agree with that. I think it'd be a waste. I think I think something that would, like, eventually you would want aid, but after there's this restructuring of the Lebanese government and hopefully run by the people, quote unquote, it's interesting that, we bring up that, again, just yesterday, I think at the time of this recording, Prime Minister Diab stepped down and his party stepped down and resigned. And he even left with a quote saying, "I said that corruption is rooted in every part of the state, but I found that corruption is greater than the state," right? It's almost this entity of its own that's just taken over Lebanese politics. Diab was actually supposed to be this reformer prime minister, and he was only been in office since December, January.
Not great.
Right, and then coronavirus hit. Not enough reforms happened. The economy tanked even harder, and this is where we are. So it's interesting that even the reformer guy was unable to do anything, and he's leaving now, warning the world of how deeply rooted this corruption is. Now what happens is, now experts expect a former prime minister, Saad Hariri, to be the leader to kind of replace Diab. But again, that's a former prime minister. He was there when all this was happening. If he is the guy that's going to come in and take power again, it's just the cycle continues.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And, what I would say, and I think I saw this as a comment somewhere on YouTube, so it's definitely not my original idea, but it was that this explosion in Beirut is their Chernobyl, right? It just exposes at its core the fallacies inside of their government. And yeah, it's like, how do you can keep replacing, your prime minister, but if the system is completely effed up, it's not going to work. And, I think the really interesting point, there was a good article in BBC that just kind of highlighted the history of Lebanon since their civil war, which ended only in the 90s. It was like 15 years, 75 to 1990. And this was a really obviously religiously divided problem where you had the Palestinians. I mean, this is kind of where you saw the religious sectarianism come out of it, right?
Right.
And I think it had about close to 150,000 fatalities. But anyways, the interesting point the BBC was making is that one of the biggest issues for this corruption, and it's something that people don't talk about enough, is the political sectarianism. Because Lebanon officially recognizes 18 religious communities, 4 Muslim ones, 12 Christian ones, a Druze sect, and then Judaism. And so the interesting thing, which I learned looking into this, was that the 3 main political offices, president, the speaker of parliament, and the prime minister, are divided amongst the 3 biggest communities. So you have Maronite Christians, Shia Muslims, and Sunni Muslims, all working in the government. And one of the big fears about this is that because of all these different sectarian groups wanting to appeal to their religious base, it leaves them very open to foreign intervention. And so, for example, Iran has been backing the Shia Hezbollah movement inside of Lebanon.
Right.
So Iran has a huge sway. And then, so for example, that really makes it hard for your country to work independently when you have Israel pushing for one side, you have the United States and other Western countries pushing for the Maronite side, and then you have Iran probably backing Hezbollah and the biggest sect. And a lot of people do actually think that if Trump, especially, like going kind of into U.S. politics involving our international affairs, if the U.S. actually could get involved and put pressure on Hezbollah inside of Lebanon, they could actually do their maximum pressure on Iran as well. So like an international Western effort to try to stop what is happening inside of Lebanon could actually hurt Iran and be part of maximum pressure. I'm probably not summing that up too well, but all this involvement, like that's why we need countries to kind of force Lebanon to maybe relook at their internal workings, because right now it's not. And there are reports coming out that do say that this ammonium that was in this port belonged to Hezbollah. And there are many factors that suggest that the Lebanese government was harboring this ammonium nitrate for Hezbollah.
Yeah.
And that's why they weren't getting rid of it. And so it's sketchy stuff, man. And I think it shows that you can have religious plurality, but you can't be open to the sways of external forces.
Yeah. Well, and you can't write down the the religious sectarianism into the Constitution, right? Because it's a requirement that the president is a Maronite Christian. It's a requirement that the Speaker of the Parliament is Shia Muslim, and it's a requirement that the Prime Minister is Sunni. That's nuts to me for someone that comes from a secular society where we try our best to separate church and state. That's crazy that they're hammering it in. They're hammering the church. They're nailing it to the state. And I saw a Lebanese person on a thread. I was looking up like threads to see what people, like Lebanese people, were saying about this. And this one guy was saying how strangely how that requirement that you had to have these certain offices be of certain religions. He said it was probably the only thing that's kept Lebanon together for the last 50 years, but it's also caused all of our worst problems. Because, you have this, like, it's almost like keeping your enemies closer than your friends, right? You all have to work in the same government, but then because of that, you're susceptible to outside forces with religious ties, and, you just fundamentally don't agree on some things. So that, I think that has to go, right? I mean, I think it's ridiculous to require a religious requirement for certain offices. And then I think also the parliament is required to be half Christian and half Muslim of whatever denomination. That's nuts to me. That is so nuts to me. I mean, I know I'm an outsider, but that still feels like that's just a formula for disaster, which we've seen. And then I think you brought up an excellent point is Hezbollah, which is kind of this political group, but then also a nefarious group associated with terrorism, has its own military apparatus, separate from the Lebanese military, that might be unfortunately there to pick up the pieces whatever happens with these riots and protests. That's a problem. Al Jazeera had an interesting article about Hezbollah and how the people will have to negotiate a new Lebanon. And they talk about how the author is, let me get here, Rami G. Khoury. He's a senior public policy fellow and journalism professor at the American University in Beirut. But he talked about how one of the main things that Lebanon needs to do is absorb or somehow dissolve this Hezbollah-run military apparatus. This is when Israel talks about fighting on the Lebanese border. They're not talking about fighting with the Lebanese military. They're talking about fighting with Hezbollah. And Hezbollah is almost acting on its own away from Lebanese authority. But in the same time, Hezbollah has influence and political clout within the Lebanese government. That's a huge issue. And I think, especially like you said, it has greater ties to Iran. And so, yeah, I do think that, we mentioned it with Belarus, that the real long-lasting social change does have to come from the people of Lebanon themselves. They have to figure this out. They have to kind of wipe the slate clean. But it's definitely a concern, an international security concern, that we definitely don't want Hezbollah to start picking up all the pieces.
Yeah, and the last thing I'll say on that is that you're absolutely correct, and unfortunately not much has changed since the end of the Civil War about 3 decades ago. I mean, according to I think the CIA in 1987, they talked about how Lebanese ports are dangerous and beyond the reach of government. So from what I'm seeing, there have been warnings for a long time about exactly what happening. And I mean, the sad reality is that ammonium nitrate is usually used for 2 things, fertilizer or bombs. And to me, it's just, I add all this up and I say, well, Iran and Hezbollah have a sway because of kind of the weak ideology in Lebanese government. So to me, it seems just like very likely that, they probably were harboring chemicals there, got out of bureaucracy's hands because of how split up bureaucracy is. But on that same note, I do have to think that the reason why they have 3 political offices and 3 religions for it was probably an outcome of the Civil War, because obviously the Civil War included Israelis, Muslims, different Muslim sects, right? And so to me, I'm just only assuming that the compromise that came out of it was this form of religious sectarianism. As bad as it is, it's probably the only way to hold the country together. So you have to think maybe Lebanon shouldn't exist the way it does now. And I'm not trying to be blowing the alarm or anything, but I'm saying if a country is held together by loose sectarian ties, is it a strong country?
Right. Well, exactly. I mean, I think that compromise, was trying to tie the country together. but it's not compatible with the 21st century world. It's not compatible with a global world that's increasingly more secular, or at least culturally mixed. I don't see this lasting, and I think, I'm really interested to see what happens. I wonder if, when whatever new prime minister gets chosen by the parliament, which is I think how it's done. It's not like there will be like a presidential election. It'll be the prime minister will be chosen by the parliament, who still has to be, Sunni Muslim. So we'll see how that goes. But I wonder if the people will accept it or reject it, whoever it is. I have a feeling. My guess is that if it is anybody that is, has been a prime minister before or a long-term politician in Lebanon, I think the people will reject them. I think the people want a deep-rooted change. And even there's been reports in the protesters that say their new slogan is "all is all." They're calling for completely wiping the slate clean, and even anti-Hezbollah slogans, which is rare to see in Lebanon.
Yeah. I mean, so I do think the silver lining to, both the movements we're talking about, obviously different political situations, but same or similar outcomes, seems to be that I think the spotlight is on these countries, and a lot of people are realizing, maybe just due to transparency, technology, discussion, whatever it may be, that these groups are not beneficial. And I think, like you said, seeing people actually outcrying against Iranian-backed groups like Hezbollah is a plus, and I think that's something to watch. And I guess we could say that there's a positive, is that 200 years ago, I don't think anyone would be protesting these governments at all,
right,
or even 50 years ago. So there is something there, and hopefully it changes. But like both of us have kind of made the theme of this episode, it needs to come from within. But I do think the U.S. needs to be the leader of this movement, because we can put money where it's best needed, and that is helping on the ground groups, right, that are already there, like Red Cross, Doctors Without Borders, groups like that are proven to help. And I would argue maybe we have a future of a more powerful NGO network, and maybe we're starting to see that. But the U.S. needs to get back to the table, and even though Macron is trying to do the right thing, I don't think just putting money towards the problem is going to work.
No, you're right. It has to be on the ground. It can't be going through any kind of government. It can't be going through the Lebanese government at all. And I think you hit the nail on the head earlier in the episode when it's, for very different reasons. But I think that we're seeing a swell of protests around the world for just some sort of accountability. I think that, whether it's longstanding corruption and ties to the Kremlin, or it's longstanding corruption and banking fraud and ties to, quasi-terrorist groups, or it's police violence in the United States, or it's Chinese spyware, people are calling for more accountability and transparency, and that's what we're seeing. That's what we're seeing right now in Lebanon and Belarus. So it's super fascinating. Again, I am sure I can speak for both of us that we really do hope that the people of Lebanon and Belarus are healthy and safe, and there's not too much violence, from oppressive factors. And I wish the best for both countries.
Yeah, I agree. And as always, you can find us here on Twitch. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, YouTube, Podbean. We're still working on Spotify. It's not going smooth, but hopefully that'll get better, and all those third-party sites. So please let us know what you think. Do you like seeing our beautiful faces, or should we go back to blackout? Please let us know. And thanks for listening, and we'll see you guys back later this week.
Take care.